Don't you dare call it a comeback, listener. All right, I mean, you can if you want, actually, because historian Maureen Ogle is making her triumphant Taplines return today to take us back to the front lines of the light beer wars, that ferocious 20th century struggle for swill-based supremacy between America's emerging macro brewers. For those of you newcomers, Maureen is the author behind the essential United States beer industry history, Ambitious Brew. She's also a longtime trusted source of yours truly, and most importantly, she's a brilliant interview to boot. Our first outing is already one of the all-time Taplines classics, and you should definitely go check it out to hear all the details on how Philip Morris and the original light beer from Miller hit the brewing industry like a less-filling freight train in the mid-'70s and touched off this war in earnest. But today, we're talking about the second half of that conflict, after Schlitz went down swinging and Big Bad Anheuser-Busch entered the chat in earnest. It's Budweiser Light, it's Maureen Ogle, it's the Light Beer Wars Part 2, and it's all right here, right now, on VinePair's Taplines. Returning to Taplines to collect her double appearance challenge coin, which is in the mail. Look forward to that. It's none other than historian, beer industry expert, author, friend of the show. She needs no introduction, but she'll get one anyway. It's Maureen Ogle. Maureen, welcome back to Taplines.
Thank you for having me, and those are very kind words. I would not describe myself as a beer industry expert, and frankly, your buds, no pun intended, your pals would probably say, she's not an industry expert. I'm only an expert in that I'm not in it. Sometimes people who aren't in it see things other people don't see.
Well, the beauty of hosting Taplines is that we don't do this by committee. What I say goes. And so on this show in particular, you are our beer history expert, at least. Okay. How about that?
That is fine. I totally take that. Yeah.
Very good. Maureen, last time you joined us here on Taplines, we had a rip-roaring discussion that I enjoyed, our listeners enjoyed so very much, about Miller Lite's introduction in 1975 and the conflict, the multifaceted industrial, commercial, cultural conflict that it touched off that is known now collectively as the Light Beer Wars. And we had a great time unpacking that. We talked about how Philip Morris was involved in, once they got a hold of what was then a pretty tired Miller Brewing Company, and then got a hold of a recipe from a Chicago brewing firm for a light beer. They sort of saw an opportunity to, in your words, Procter and Gambleize the beer market, to find new products to sell to new segments of consumer, which was a sexy, slick MBA, sort of approach to retail, to commerce. Definitely. At that time. Yeah. And, this is a lot of what we relied on in that conversation. Certainly what I relied on was the work that you did in Ambitious Brew, which is your history of the American beer business in all its sort of, sudsy glory, or whatever you want to call it. This is the tome that I turn to whenever I'm looking for historical context, if I'm not able to get you, Maureen, on the phone to chat about it in person. But I would love to kick it right off, basically where we left our story last. So one of the last things we touched on before we pressed that little red button and stopped recording last time here on Taplines with Maureen was the infamous quotation from Anheuser-Busch's August Busch III in a Business Week article where Miller at this point is charging forward. Miller Lite is having tremendous success. They've got buckets of cigarette cash that they're just throwing into the business and changing the game. And they ask, Augie Busch if he's worried, or if what Anheuser-Busch is going to do. And he says, tell Miller to come right along, but tell them to bring lots of money. That's where we stopped last time. Maureen, what happens next?
What happened next? It even kind of surprised me. The money came right along. That's for starters. The money definitely came right along. I should just remind listeners and viewers AB tended then to let everybody else screw up before they would get into a hot new category. So they didn't release a light beer until I think 3 or 4 years after Miller Lite, and theirs was, of course, completely different. It was Natural Light. So it wasn't until 1982 that the company finally decided to launch what was initially called Budweiser Light, and the tagline was bring out your best.
Bring
Yeah,
out your best. That's right. Yep.
bring out your best. Yeah, with this catchy little jingle attached to it. And they quickly realized that they were going to have to do a lot more than that, because Miller Lite just had this grip, a strangling grip. So they changed the shtick for Bud. First of all, they changed the name to Bud Light sometime in around 1983 or 84.
84, I think it was, yeah.
84. They just decided to separate the two because they realized, Miller could get away by adding LITE. That was pretty obvious. So anyway, they changed the name to Bud Light. And when people would go into a bar and apparently ask for a light beer, what they would always get was a Miller, because that's what people were drinking. So the ad campaign was, give me a light. Somebody walks into a bar, give me a light. And so someone hands them a blowtorch, or somebody hands them a tiki torch, or a branding iron, and the idea was, add that other word to it. Just say Bud Light. Don't just give me a light. And then just as a part-time promotion aimed entirely at spring break college kids, in 1985 and into 1986, the company launched a small side campaign based on a character named Spuds McKenzie, a terrier who was the ultimate party animal. And his first big appearance was on a poster that was handed out, at these company-sponsored spring break
Daytona Beach, Panama City.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they got him a T-shirt, and he was a member of Delta Omega Gamma, and he's adorable. If you've never seen Spuds, you really owe it to yourself to go see what Spuds look like. And that turned out to be so far off the charts, more than Anheuser-Busch thought, that because it really was never intended to be a big thing. But they realized when they were selling millions of caps and T-shirts and posters and blah, and a lot more beer.
Yeah.
They gave him the big time. They gave Spuds the Super Bowl in 1987. So in January 1987, Spuds was revealed to the world. And for the next year, he would show up at red carpet events. He was in People magazine.
He's on late night TV shows.
Late night TV shows. I mean, this character, it was genius.
Yeah.
And every distributor had at least one costume. So, Spuds could go everywhere. And he had different costumes. Sometimes he went skiing. At the Olympics, he went skiing, and
he would have a Hawaiian shirt with a luau on for spring break.
Exactly. There was no way. Even I didn't even have a TV, and I didn't drink beer then, but even I knew who Spuds McKenzie was.
Huge.
Naturally, that party couldn't last too long. In December of 1987, after this wonderful rollout in January of 1987, Strom Thurmond, who is mercifully no longer with us, but was a deep Southern Democrat, rose on the floor of the Senate to denounce Spuds and the fact that AB was peddling liquor to children.
Yeah.
And that actually turned into a whole big brouhaha that in itself is noteworthy. It just turned into a whole sideshow that didn't have anything to do with light beer. But the point of going through all that is that it worked. And in 1994, for the first time, Bud Light was the number one selling light beer in the country. And it had gotten past Miller Lite. In fact, I think, Miller Lite was second, and then Coors Light. But what's most interesting is if you stand back and look, by the early 1990s, light beer had simply taken over the entire American beer market,
This
except
was
for the
effectively
craft wing.
beer. Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
By 2000, it was something like half the volume of beer. The top in 19, if I can find it, I'm terrible with numbers and dates and shit. Oh, I didn't bring that in here. But in 1994, of the top 10 beers, 6 of them were light beers. I mean,
Whoa.
light beers were it.
Yeah.
And then again, I'm intentionally leaving out the craft, because that
Right.
in 2000 was like 4% of the market, so we can just leave them out.
Sure.
But light beer in the 90s just turned into this incredible behemoth.
It's a juggernaut, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it just steamrolled everything else out of the picture. And by the mid 90s, for example, August Bush IV had come on board by then. He was around in the 1990s, and he was in charge of Budweiser, not Bud
Sure.
Light, because they're all different brands, right? And he really Budweiser's getting cannibalized, so
Hmm.
he starts throwing everything he thinks of. He. I have this great quote, if I can find it real fast, and probably I won't be able to. But oh yeah, in 1993. Things are not good for Budweiser, which by that point had been the number one selling beer in the country, period, end of
Hmm.
story. And now
Yep.
suddenly it's not, and it's struggling. So he, for example, starts selling it in 10-ounce and 24-ounce cans and 22-ounce bottles and an 18-can pack. And he said, this is what I love. Why not take a brand with established equity and introduce a new can rather than spend all the money to introduce a new product? Well, why indeed? Why indeed? Because a 24-ounce can, is going to certainly cheaper, right? Didn't make any difference, but you could have probably put it in a 60-ounce can and it probably wouldn't have made any difference. It is very difficult to overstate just how profound the impact of light beer was by the year 2000. When it started in 1975, absolutely nobody knew that it would turn out that the overwhelming majority of American beer drinkers wanted to drink a
Yeah.
beer with fewer calories. Who knew? So in that case, what I think is particularly interesting about August Bush the Fourth's take on this. Now, again, his brand was Budweiser, but he started to realize that the market had effectively fragmented into 3 pieces. One of them was very small, the craft brewers. Again, we'll just forget them for the moment.
Yeah. Forget about craft beer.
The
Yeah.
other thing is the juggernaut, the light beers. Well, I guess there's 4 things, because by then the imports were
You got some
starting, and
imports. Sure.
imports means one of 2 things. It means Heineken or it means Corona. It's not high-end, fancy German beers that have been around for 500 years. We're talking basic beers, right?
Right. Right.
And then the 4th category is everything else. And August Bush the Fourth, decided to. In his mind, Budweiser had become something you could play off both sides. If you think craft beer, they were called microbrews then. If you think micro beer is too heavy and bitter, then Budweiser's a good beer for you.
Hmm.
But if you think the light beers are too light, then Budweiser's probably perfect for you. So he keeps trying to thread this needle, and it simply doesn't work. And it's not just Budweiser. Miller Lite is essentially no longer living.
High life. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
Miller High Life.
Yep.
Yes,
Yep. Yep.
High
Yep.
Life, not light. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And so the logical thing to do in capitalist market, capitalism runs on novelty. Apparently, the novelty, well, light beer wasn't exactly a novelty, but from 2000 on, the quest became how many ways can we market beer with virtually no calories and beer with virtually no alcohol? Michelob Ultra, which I think today is still a huge seller. Someone
Oh, an
correct me on
absolute
that.
beast.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
No.
like it's just a thing, right? I've never
Very much
tasted it.
so. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've never tasted a light beer, but in the early aughts, 2002 or somewhere around there, AB decided to take what was basically its premier beer. It's its perhaps best beer.
This is Michelob that you're talking about.
Michelob, right?
Yeah,
You know,
full
it's not
flavored,
for
premium. This
right.
is
It's got malt, it's got hops. You know, it is their premier beer, and they
yep.
start knocking the calories out of it first. So you get Michelob Ultralight, then the low carb thing comes in,
Mhm.
and low now. I personally, I mean, we're talking, 65 calories and maybe 1 gram of carbs.
Sure.
I don't really know what that means in real life, but apparently people care about stuff like that. So brewers, big brewers in the US spent from 2000 until, well, they're probably still doing it, at least until 2007, trying to spin low calorie beer every conceivable way you can do it, using every advertising thing you can think of. But just, I can't even imagine. I can't imagine what one of those beers tastes like. And I think it just says something about Americans' relationship to beer, that the overwhelming desirable beer in the United States was essentially slightly alcoholic, slightly tasty water.
Right, right.
You
Like a
know, you
malt.
know,
It's like a malt soda at that point. Right. Yeah,
yeah, except I don't even think you could taste the malt. So it's but the early aughts are just full of variants on a light beer. I mean, I'm kind of stupefied by how many ways you could sell a light beer. At one point, AB was putting blueberry juice into one of theirs. I mean, it was like, what is the bottom? When are we going to hit bottom with
right.
this?
Well,
But
and they eventually would. Yeah.
that's right. That's right. In 2007, for the first time, light beers started to slip as a category. By this time, regular beer, it's just not there anymore. The premium beers, the premium, by this time, there are premium low alcohol beers, and one of them is from Heineken. And I just have to read this because I fell in love with this comment, this marketing shtick. This is 2005, and so now what you're going to do is make a luxury, an ultra premium beer with no calories and no carbs, right? So
Hmm.
this is the Heineken line. Their thing was, this is smooth, right? Meet something smooth tonight. Someone smooth is waiting for you at the bar. Are you getting the smoothness you need? So, this is Heineken, right? God, I
This is
mean,
high powered stuff. This is
yeah, 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 I guess. Again, it's just not clear how many ways you can strip things. Anyway, in 2007, the market finally starts to drop for light beers.
right.
And Michelob remained, and apparently still is, for whatever reason, the one beer that would keep gaining sales, especially after they came out with, I think it's called Michelob Ultra Gold, which was made with
Yeah,
organic
they're
rice
organic
and
one.
malt.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Again, um, just throw everything you have, take everything out of the beer, except it's not working that well anymore. And
right.
by 2007, things, particularly for Miller, had become rather desperate. And in 2008, two things happened that don't have anything directly to do with light beer, but they definitely have a lot to do with beer making in general. In 2008, the Brazilian Dutch conglomerate InBev bought Anheuser-Busch. August Busch III agreed to sell his family's company. Not that the
Hmm.
family held the majority, but anyway, the company was sold. And perhaps more interesting, SAB Miller had been sold in 2002. I should have mentioned that. Philip Morris sold Miller Brewing to South African Breweries, another big international conglomerate, in 2002. In 2008, about, I don't know, a month or so after the AB sale went through, SAB Miller and Molson Coors merged their North American operations because they were the two. They make Miller Lite and they make Coors Light, and
Right.
those have been the number 2 and number 3, switching back and forth, best-selling beers in America for, at that point, at 15 years,
Sure.
something like that.
And at
Right.
this point, we get Miller Coors, which is
Right.
in 2008. That's what that North American operation
That's right.
becomes.
That's
Not
right.
to be confused with Molson Coors,
That's right.
which when AB acquires SAB Miller in 2017, I want to say, midway through this past decade.
Yeah, it's 2016 or 17, yeah.
They are required to divest that portion amongst other pieces of SAB Miller's business, and so now we get Molson Coors.
Right.
Maureen,
And
hang
go
on.
ahead.
You must be stopped. You just went on a 40-year tear.
Yeah, I did. But it's so weird. The whole thing is so weird. So go ahead, Dave.
I
agree.
agree. I mean, it was fantastic, and watching you work was quite a sight to behold. But listeners who aren't as intimately familiar with the beer business as me, or especially as you, might be feeling their heads spin a little bit. So
they should. Yeah.
What I would like to, now that we've kind of established the timeline, we've bracketed, right? So in 1975, Miller Lite comes out. There had been light beers before, but this is the one that really plants the flag as a category and goes on to revitalize Miller's business. That's, the subject of our previous episode on this. In 2008, driven by market forces, driven by changing tastes amongst consumers who just simply aren't drinking as much beer anymore, and finally tire of these heavily engineered, super low calorie light beers, and are starting to show a little bit. That category starts to show a little bit of fatigue. We start to see mergers amongst some of these titans in order to shore up their businesses, because simply rolling out the latest and greatest light beer is no longer producing the returns that they want. So 1975 to 2008, the intervening years are where most of the fighting, if you want to stick with the metaphor of the light beer wars, that's where most of the fighting happens, right? So once I would love to, if we can, just kind of zoom in on a couple of those turning points that you mentioned, that AB takes, because I think what's so interesting about this is you mentioned the way Anheuser-Busch historically had approached sort of upstart products, right? You talked about this earlier. We talked about it with Anat Baron on a recent episode of Taplines as well. Listener, you can go back and listen to that one. But the general pattern is, first, they ignore whatever's going on. They say, this is stupid, we're not going to do it, we're just going to not pay attention to it, right?
Yes.
And then they finally, if they say, okay, now this is a bit, it's a big enough thing, we can no longer ignore it, because a lot of this stuff would just sort of burn itself out quickly, right? And so AB is not going to jump on the latest and greatest just for no reason. Then they say, well, wait a second, we need something here. So they maybe are going to go copy you, right? They're going to say, all right, well, Miller Lite's got light beer, let's one up them, basically doing the same thing, but introducing Natural Light, right? All organic product, right? Like, this is, Natural Light. And this is one better than Miller Lite. Not only do we have low calories, but we have light. And then maybe if that doesn't work, they're going to eventually maybe look to buy you, right? And so we see that less in the light beer industry, or in the light beer segment, but certainly, we've sort of intentionally taken out of our conversation today the rising pesky hirsute craft beer industry that is
hirsute, yes.
A bunch of these hairy dudes from the Pacific Northwest, for the most part, are making these full flavored beers. And Anheuser-Busch, even well prior to the 2011 acquisition of Goose Island, which was sort of the big one that everyone thinks of, but 2 decades earlier, Anheuser-Busch was already looking to buy their way into the craft beer segment at that time, mostly as a hedge against whatever this category is going to become, right? They can't
Right.
kill it. They can't copy it. They try with Pacific Ridge and with Zwigenbach to knock off Shinerbach or whatever. Like, and no one wants those beers. So they start buying into Red Hook. They start buying into the
Hmm.
Craft Brewers Alliance out in the Pacific Northwest. So that's the pattern, right? And this happens a bunch of different times over Anheuser-Busch's history, and then even Anheuser-Busch InBev, which is a drastically different company that really only shares the name with Anheuser-Busch in
That's
terms of
right.
like its
Yeah.
corporate DNA. Like it's a totally
Hmm.
different company, but they do this to some extent as well. Natural Light is 1977, and I think it's worth starting, to just kind of like zoom in at least momentarily there, because you wrote in your book that Natural Light is, quote, round one in an Anheuser-Busch campaign to demolish Miller, close quote. So
Hmm.
this is very intentionally at the time.
Oh,
This is
yeah.
their Miller killer, right? Like this is okay, we can't ignore this light beer category anymore. Miller, with Philip Morris's backing, which is crucial to remember, Miller is selling a shitload of this beer in a way that is
Yeah.
starting to be a problem for Anheuser-Busch. Not existential, but it's clear that it's not going away. We need to do something. That something at first is Natural Light. And I think what's significant there, or something that I wanted to unpack just briefly with you, is it's not till 1982, 5 years later, that they finally roll out Budweiser Light, which
Hmm.
carries the flagship name. And so I was hoping
Hmm.
that you could speak a little bit to what that signaled when they roll out Budweiser Light with the flagship name as opposed to Natural Light. I mean, to me, this seems like the company is putting all its chips behind this anymore. It's not just this little dinky, new brand that we spun up. We're going for it with the name that made us famous.
Yes.
What's the significance? Is that more or less what's going on there?
It. I think their reluctance. I don't think I've read enough to know their reluctance was that internally they were very worried about damaging the Budweiser name.
Mm,
Right? Miller Lite was Miller Lite. It wasn't Miller High Life Light. It's a different beer.
right.
And Natural Light doesn't have the word Budweiser anywhere in it. That there at that point, at that time, Budweiser is the biggest selling beer in the country and
It's
remains
the king
so.
of beers, right? Like we
That's
say
right. It
that
is the
now. That's
king
a
of
tongue
beers.
in cheek. That now that's a tongue
Right.
in cheek nickname, but that was at the
No,
time where it came from.
it
Yeah.
was. It was. And it is clear that Anheuser-Busch was actually not really expecting light beer to go anywhere. And, corporations are big. They move at pretty slow speeds, and there were personality issues involved. August Bush III had only recently seized control from his father,
That's
effectively
Gussie.
booting. Yeah, he just
Gussie.
kind
Yeah.
of booted him out of the company. And now Triple Sticks, as he was called, August Bush III. Now he's in charge, and I'll say I've never met the guy, but I will say he ranks up there. If you want to talk about businessmen who are like focused, smart, know what they're doing, but have enough caution so they're not stupid. He's that guy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I will say that this was the same time when Budweiser was dipping toes into the Chinese market. So
Interesting.
that,
Even back
yeah,
then.
yes, and that what I interpret that is that August Bush III is really starting to rethink the nature of the Anheuser-Busch company. Now that it's his,
Wow.
now he can really go where his vision wants it to go. He was mocked publicly by other beer makers for going to China, so he probably regrets to this day. He backed off China, and it was another 10 years before they finally went in big, at which point they had a lot of competition that they wouldn't have had if they'd gone in the 80s.
They
But
could
my
have
point is,
owned the Chinese market in
that's right. They if
1977
they'd
or
done
whatever.
that,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right. That's right.
And
I
this
was
is this
there.
is extremely forward thinking, listener. Like, keep in mind that like
Mhm.
it's not only until 1972 that Nixon goes to China, right? Like
Yes.
the opening up of Red China, quote unquote, is like this is recent history. So the idea that
Yeah.
an executive of such a traditionalist company as Anheuser-Busch was already seeing the opportunity in
Oh,
pivoting
yeah.
American brands into Asian markets. I mean, like, that's the type of visionary that August Busch III, whether or not you like him, that's the sort of
Yes.
thing he was bringing to the table at this time.
That's right. That's right. And so I focus on him because that is the way to think about Budweiser, the brand.
Mm.
It has been the heart and soul of the company. They didn't, I'll just give everybody a very quick history. Anheuser-Busch and Adolphus Busch did not invent Budweiser. They brewed it on contract for a friend of Adolphus Busch's in the 1870s. It came out in 1876. It was wildly popular. Eventually, the actual owner, a guy named Carl Conrad, was unable to keep paying his bills. And so Anheuser-Busch just took the brand in exchange for the debt. So it has been, and it has belonged completely to Anheuser-Busch since, I believe, 1888. So, it was the thing that made them famous. This was their king beer. This was like king of the heat. So, fast forward to 1980, 1979. If you're August Busch III, you're going to think long and hard before you start fiddling with the idea of Budweiser. I'm actually kind of surprised that the original, after Natural Light, that the next light beer they came out, they called Budweiser Light. Man, that took, I would love to have been in on the conversation about that, but it didn't last long.
Obviously, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Obviously,
No, go
you
ahead.
weren't in on the conversation, but you have done so much research and you sort of have reported out the way these conversations go. You and other historians, I'm thinking of William Nodelstater's Bitter Brew. He also has reporting from sort of that hemming and hawing at the time.
Yes.
When you say reluctance that this company has and you say you're surprised about it, I mean, like, the major players are who? August Busch III, obviously, is the head honcho, but he's got a phalanx of executives, some of whom are loyal to Gussie, are loyal to the man who came before, right?
Probably not by then, no.
Not by then. He got rid of them.
No,
He purged them all.
I would say probably not by then. I've never actually dug into, who replaced who, but
Comings and goings, yeah.
Yeah, I would say that I would definitely say by 1980, August Busch III was damn sure this was his company.
He's consolidated power in the C-suite. There's no one that,
right, on the board of directors in management. No, this is his company.
Yep. Gotcha.
And the Bush family has not been majority owners of that company since I think like 1931 or something like that.
Right.
But it had always been run by someone named Bush.
Mm-hmm.
And the Bush family was, to them, their identity is Anheuser-Busch and especially Budweiser. So the tinkering with Budweiser required a fair amount of
chutzpah,
steel in the spine, because we're not quite sure what's going to happen. And I'm not surprised that after a year they just changed the name and changed their approach to it, because Bud Light, the way it was marketed, it's almost like they were starting fresh. This isn't Budweiser anymore. This is a beer called Bud Light. I know that doesn't sound like much, but it can actually mean a lot to a marketing vice president and a customer.
And to your point, earlier you mentioned the rollout slogan, and it was "Bring Out Your Best," and the campaign was very intentionally done with a Clydesdale. It was Budweiser Light.
Yes.
Here's the Clydesdale. But 2 years later, 1984, they rebrand as Bud Light, and gone is, they start thinking of this not as a line extension of Budweiser. They start trying to communicate to drinkers, no, this is something totally different.
Exactly.
Because, and so again, like, I think one of the things I find so fascinating about Ambitious Brew, about that book, Bitter Brew, that I mentioned, Dethroning the King is another one that I've got on the shelf behind me here. AB is such this big, powerful company, but it's run by personalities at this point, and specifically the Bush personalities. Yes. So there's a fair amount of like Kremlinology that you have to do in like their public-facing decisions in order to like figure out like what they're up to, how they're thinking about these brands, and in excising the Clydesdale imagery from Budweiser Light
Yes.
as it truncates the name down to Bud Light. That is a major signal to both drinkers and distributors, and certainly the retailers as well,
That's
all
right.
their business partners, that this is its own thing now.
Right. That's right. And it's worth noting that when Spuds was introduced at the 1987 Super Bowl, he was introduced in the Bud Light commercials. The
Mm-hmm.
Clydesdales were the stars of the Budweiser commercials. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, they completely split these two beers. Now, I'm going to say at the outset, someone could argue that Miller Lite, Lite, was an extension of Miller High Life. I don't really think it was, but Miller had made Miller and Coors both made the big mistake once it became clear that Americans wanted low calorie beer. They pretty much sank everything into it. They didn't have backups. If there's
Mm-hmm.
any one thing that kept Anheuser-Busch above the fray and not worried too much about the bottom line, is that they always had backups constantly. But if you look at the Coors lineup, there's
That's
Coors
it.
Light and there's
It's
Coors,
Coors and
Miller
Coors
High
Light,
Life, and there's
right?
Miller Lite, right? I mean, which in retrospect,
And what, two breweries for Coors versus maybe 12, I think, maybe 8 at that point for
yes,
Anheuser-Busch, 2
yes,
for Miller versus, I mean, like we're talking about the
that's
fact
right.
that those two companies were able to compete at that time speaks volumes to the quality of beer, the quality of marketing, all of the things that go into it, because at scale they were not able to compete at this time.
No, but I think the way to think about that, here's just a little bit of context. There's also nobody else. And the difference between number one and number two is huge, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
by roughly 95 or thereabouts, Anheuser-Busch has half of the beer market. The other
Wow.
two have about 20% each, and imports are clawing away at them. So Miller and Coors were always coming at this from a position of weakness relative to Anheuser-Busch.
This is a survival play for. I mean, explicitly was a survival play for Coors Light. Their stock is crashing in
Yes.
1978. Miller and Anheuser-Busch are eating their lunch in the Western market because they can't. Bill
Mm-hmm.
and Joe Coors are stubborn and refuse to jump into the live beer market. They need this beer. Miller Lite. Philip
Right.
Morris is driving the bus and says, well, wait a second, let's make all this money doing this. We need this beer. Otherwise, this is just some sleepy asset that we picked up for,
Yeah.
and we're going to just divest it, right? So these are necessity plays for Miller and Coors. Anheuser-Busch has come in with all the money in the world, all the expertise in the world, and brings muscle to this category in a way that the other two players simply aren't. And that's
Yes.
probably part of the reason why they were able to capture so much of that segment so quickly.
That's right, and it's also worth noting that, say, by 1990, I think Stroh's finally collapsed in like
Right. Right.
1994. Schlitz shot itself in the head in 1980. Pabst was gone. So if you're an American in circa, say, between 1990 and 2000, and all you want is a beer, you don't have that many choices. Like if you
Right.
don't want a
Right.
craft beer, right? Because craft beer is very small. I have no idea in 1994 if I could even buy any craft beer in the town I live in. I live in a
Right.
small
Right.
town in Iowa, right? It's so if you go to the store, what you're going to see are essentially six main beers and then a handful of beers that are owned by holding companies, things like Blatz and Hams.
Rheingold. Yeah. Yeah.
They're
Right.
labeled Pabst.
Brown
They're just
Derby.
labels.
Yep.
They're
Yep.
not,
Yep. Yep.
Pabst is being made at Miller Brewing. That's one of the things, by the way, that pays the bills for Miller. They're making a lot of these holding company beers, so that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that keeps them going. But what you can choose from is Bud, Miller, or Coors, Bud Light, Natural Light, Miller Lite, or Coors Light, because everybody else is out of business.
Mm-hmm.
There is. So we're talking about a relatively small group of objects from
Options.
which
Yeah.
to
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
choose.
Right.
You know what I mean? There's just not that much going on, and this is a case where Anheuser-Busch simply had the institutional memory, I think, to be able to play the cards right. Remember, Miller lost all of its old people that they had in circa 1970, and then began churning their executives at Miller as things, as Anheuser-Busch steps things up, and the Coors brothers are just having trouble. They really thought they could go out there and kill Anheuser-Busch, and it didn't work, and now they're stuck with the consequences. So if there's a player in this who's got an upper edge, there's no doubt whatsoever that it's Anheuser-Busch, just because they've got what I guess you could call a deep bench. They can handle it.
Sure. And Bud Light becomes, it was not really a misstep in 1982 that it was named Budweiser Light. That's just a blip. It was no problem whatsoever. They rebranded to Bud Light in 1984. By 1985, again, this citation is your book, Ambitious Brew. I'm quoting here, Americans may have been drinking less beer in recent years, but more of what they were drinking was Budweiser and Bud Light. And that's a close quote. In 1985, Bud Light alone does 5.4 million barrels of beer, up from 1.2 million just 1 year prior. So, this thing shot out of a cannon basically from the jump, right?
It did. It is, and the Spuds thing
supercharges it.
It did, and even when Spuds had to be retired, to make
sent to a nice farm
happy.
Upstate,
something like that, right?
Sent to Grant's farm,
By that time, man, the job was done, and it was not until 1994 that Bud Light finally outsold Miller Lite, but they had been neck and neck in sales, and by that time, by the mid 90s, Miller is starting to realize that they've got to come up with something, which is one reason why they bought Leinenkugel, which turned out to be the smartest thing Miller could have done.
Leinenkugel is an early craft brewing company in Wisconsin. Is it Wisconsin, I think?
Yes.
Upper Midwest. Yeah. Maybe Minnesota, but the Leinenkugel family. So again, we're seeing some visionary foresight on all sides of the battle here. I mean, that was I think, pretty early bit of wisdom in Miller's case, where they saw how big it was going to be.
No, that was, as I say, that was one of the smartest things that Miller did. And if they hadn't done that, I'm not sure that they might have been sold off to SAB a whole lot sooner than they were, because they had bulwark. That.
Yeah.
They also had famously had a pilot. Coors had a pilot brewery and introduced. I don't remember when they introduced Blue Moon. Someone will remember. I have this vague sense it's in the early 90s.
Yeah, I think it's mid 90s that Blue Moon hits. Yeah,
and it was marketed as. Well, they could not exactly a micro brew, but something that would fit into the category of a beer that's not regular beer. It's not a light beer, and it's not Coors.
Yep.
Blue Moon is, and Blue Moon also is still around.
Powerful brand, successful brand. Yeah.
Yes.
1995, Blue Moon hits the shelf. So you're dead on. Mid 90s, we're talking about here. And these are ways that these number 2 and 3 firms can try to compete on the margins. If you think about it, and I think the allegory of the battlefield is kind of useful, right? Because no one is going to get into a shooting war with Anheuser-Busch and win, right? That's not possible. You bring the infantry to the front lines, you lower your muskets, and guess what? They've got more. Bummer. But if you can flank them, if you can find little ways to pick them off here and there, if you can find little opportunities to advance the line in places they're not paying attention, like craft beer, like these innovations like Blue Moon, which is, we would come to think of as sort of a pseudo craft beer, but as introduces the idea of fruiting a beer and serving it as more of a premium cocktail experience to the American drinker writ large. These are opportunities for the other players on the battlefield to survive and in some cases thrive, right?
That's right. The thing that craft beer is known for in the 1990s very famously is that there was I keep saying craft, micro beer. There was a bubble. There was a big wave of investment by people who had no idea what they were doing. Right. And naturally, that always happens, right? When something new comes along, a category disruptor, a lot of people show up, and virtually all of them, no one hears about ever again.
We're talking about dilettantes. We're talking about investors with deep pockets who want lifestyle businesses. We're talking about imbeciles who just think they're going to be great and have no idea what they're doing. Yeah,
but
you get all kinds.
but also people like Steve Hindy, and I'm drawing a total blank on his partner, who
Garrett
went in
Oliver.
the
Well, yeah.
1990 Brooklyn Brewing in
Yep.
the 1990s. They went to a craft brewers conference and they said, "By God, we can do that." So some
Yep.
people did succeed. So my point is, there's all this other stuff going on, but it's off the radar of these big giants.
Because that's
Except
1% of the market, maybe 2% of the
Yeah,
market,
in
maybe. Yeah, yeah,
2000,
yeah,
2000 it was 4%. So
yeah.
it's not huge, but for example, Anheuser Busch, this really was them just throwing something on the wall to see if it would stick. In the 1990s, they kept introducing their their interpretation of a microbrew, complete with weird names. I mean, they didn't go so far as to name it Moose Drool. I don't remember the names of them. They
Oh yeah, this is
also,
what I was talking about earlier. They had Pacific Ridge, they had Green Valley
yes,
Brewing Company, they had Elk
yes,
Mountain Red Ale, which,
yes,
by the way, is the name of their corporate hop farm. It's not
yeah,
like an actual,
yeah.
right there. Yeah, no,
I
you're
think
totally right. Yeah, yeah.
Annette Barron in the film, I think she goes to look for Spring Valley, doesn't she?
She
It's
goes,
like a
yeah, she
vacant
goes to
lot.
Green Valley.
Right, yeah.
Correct. We talked
Yes,
about this with her on the episode. She goes to Fairfield, California, and she's like, hey,
yeah.
where's Green Valley? She's doing man on the street interviews. And everyone's like, we only have one brewery here, man. It's the Anheuser-Busch Brewery.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
Anheuser-Busch also went into their own archives. Now, this, I think, this is one thing that I, as an historian, deeply regret. They went into their archives, which are extraordinary. I was never allowed to do anything more than stand in the doorway and look at them, so I could feel bad about all the stuff that I was never going to be. Anyway, they had more than a century's worth of beer recipes that
Sure.
they may or may not have ever brewed. And so in the 90s, Anheuser-Busch did introduce, sadly, too briefly, a line of originals using these recipes. But I think that internally they just didn't have the right people who knew how to market beers like that to people who really only want low calorie beers.
Sure.
That was really, it was almost like they just couldn't bring themselves to commit to it
Well, I
enough to
think
make it work.
you're totally right because I mean, I've reported various aspects of this out over the years. And one of the folks that I talked with was Tim Schoen, who was involved in this sort of like Skunk Works project to produce craft beer from AB that looks and feels like, independent
Hmm.
microbrew,
Yeah.
right? And one of
Hmm.
the points that he made to me is like all the best people, all the resources, all of the focus is on Bud Light at Anheuser-Busch at this time. They don't actually give a shit if they sell any Pacific Ridge.
That's
These
right.
were, I think, probably best understood as what the industry calls category killers, right? Like if they succeed, great, and we got some revenue off them. If they fail, great. Like everyone's gonna hate craft beer because they drank a sucky knockoff from Budweiser or from Anheuser-Busch that's everywhere and it has been distributed widely, right? So like, it's a win-win, but it's a Pyrrhic victory or it's a Pyrrhic, strategy again
That's
to use
right.
like the battlefield
That's
or
right.
the battlefield metaphor there. Yeah, yeah, no, totally. And yeah, he was very clear about that. He's like getting attention on this in turn. I mean, we had some
Mm.
good beers, we had some bad beers, but like the fact of the matter was they were never going to go anywhere because we had so much trouble pulling everyone away from just watching the rocket
Hmm.
ship of Bud Light,
Yes, yeah, yeah. And August Bush the fourth was vice president of the Bud Light brand or the Budweiser. I think the Bud Light brand. And so I think at the time there was a bit of discomfort, probably on the part of other executives. In any case, yes, it is true. Bud Light just ate up all the oxygen
Yep.
just over and over again. When there were other opportunities, the company just chose not to follow through on them, but again, they had backups. Budweiser remained the best-selling Budweiser, not Bud Light, the best-selling brand. Michelob Light was an immediate bestseller for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They were still selling Michelob. Busch Light. They also introduced Busch Light, which was a lower cost version of Bud Light. So they have lots of irons in the fire. And
Yeah.
it was not lost on anybody in the industry at the time that the only two remaining big breweries had no irons in the fire other than their two light beers. So
Right. Right.
Ugh.
I want to before we let you go and we send you away with your
My God, it's been
triumphant.
an hour? Oh,
Yeah, so I
how
mean,
did that happen? Wow.
this is the danger when you come on Taplines, Maureen. We just time stops and you
I
pick your head up, and
guess.
yeah, you've been asleep for 40 years, and everything is different now. um,
uh,
so I wanted to focus on, again, just like, I think like the allegory of warfare is so instructive, and of course it's overblown. We're not talking about actual warfare. We're talking about selling beer. This is not,
mhm.
you know, this is industry mythos more than it is like actual. No one's like, this is not the Teamsters, right? Like pushing, trucks of competitors into Lake Michigan or something. There's no actual violence going on here, right? For the
Well,
most part.
there's kickbacks.
Yeah, right? Well, but I
There's
mean,
kickbacks.
a victimless crime, I would argue.
Okay, okay.
I'm
All
kidding.
right.
I'm
Well, that's
kidding.
one way. No, you're right. But you're right. You're right. It's not. Yeah.
In other
Yeah.
words, like, we're not talking about mob-oriented violence. We're talking about corporate violence, right? And that looks and feels differently. And one of the things that we've brought up, in this episode and in previous episodes, one of the ways you fight this battle is advertising. I mean, we talked about
Mm-hmm.
Miller Lite's fantastic rollout. They got Rodney Dangerfield. They got all the macho former athletes. We talked about Spuds McKenzie in 1987 trots onto the scene. This cute terrier with the eye patch that he's got, or the color around his eyes, very iconic. And he all of a sudden is this gangbusters weapon in Anheuser-Busch's arsenal to sell Bud Light. Another way you fight this battle, if you're Anheuser-Busch or you're Miller, is you work the refs, right? Like you look
Mm-hmm.
to someone else to referee or to intercede. I suppose in the UN metaphor, this would be the UN, or in the warfare metaphor, this would be the UN. I'm mixing my metaphors. The point is, one of the ways that they fight is legal challenges to one another.
Yes.
And this is
Yeah.
asymmetrical, and it is, if not self-acknowledgedly bullshit, it's very widely interpreted as just a way for them to get under one another's skin, to suck time and resources away from the focus of marketing these beers. Hey, if we can tie up Miller in BATF, investigation over one of their brands, well, guess what? That's more resources that they can't spend on beating us in this market with Miller Lite or whatever. And two, I think in particular that you highlighted in the book, are in, I guess, what was it? I think like 1970, mid 70s, like as Miller Lite starts coming in 1978. So late 70s, as Miller Lite has established itself very clearly as a problem for Anheuser-Busch. Anheuser-Busch, kind of snitches to the FTC and says, hey, can you look into their Lowenbrau brand?
Yes.
Because that's not actually a real German import, and they're tricking consumers with import prices, but domestic beer, right? And so this is AB interpreted certainly with the benefit of hindsight. This is AB just kind of, some skullduggery, some corporate skullduggery from a competitor. Yes. And then Miller returns the favor, right? Who did they went after AB for something? For Natty Light, for Natural Light, right? Just, I think later that year, or maybe the following.
Okay. Yeah.
Because AB was marketing, there was organic beer, right? Or there was made with organic ingredients. And Miller's like, there's no way they're doing that. It's not. And so they asked the TTV, or the BATF, which would, runs the TTV, to look into that. So they're throwing mud at each other too. They're not just fighting.
Yes.
They're not just fighting for space in the beer aisle. They're also fighting one another in the court of public opinion with advertising, and then the actual courts with these semi spurious lawsuits designed to confuse and to suck resources from their competitor.
That's right. And when they could and get away with it, Anheuser-Busch in particular used those very points in their own advertising. I don't remember now the exact date of this one, but at one point I think it was when Coors built another plant, man, Anheuser-Busch went right after them in advertising saying, that light beer made with Rocky Mountain spring water?
Right.
I don't think so. Lowenbrau, is this really a Lowenbrow? You know, is it? Yes, yes,
Right.
yes. And those
And
things also get press, right? I
yeah,
mean, the legal squabbles themselves get press, and you can use them in marketing. So, oh yeah, there's there is absolutely no doubt, at least in the mind of collective mind of Anheuser-Busch, that the Miller Brewing Company was a problem to be solved. I don't think they ever really took Coors
they didn't care about
seriously,
Coors.
other than the fact that Coors Light was always one of the top three beers. It was pretty
Yeah,
much
yeah.
always number three. But otherwise, yeah, I don't think they ever really, they didn't. But they, it's clear that Anheuser-Busch was just determined to grind Miller into the ground. And it's not surprising that in 2002, Philip Morris said, okay,
Yeah,
we're
these
done
guys are
with
nuts.
this.
These guys are
Yeah,
lunatic.
yeah.
Like they
Here,
care way too
you
much. This
take
is
it. Yeah,
annoying. Yeah,
yeah.
right.
You take it off our hands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that the fact that AV didn't care about Coors, or it's an also ran, right? Like Michael Phelps didn't care about the guy coming in third in the pool
That's
either.
right.
Like
That's right.
like
That's
it's like it's
right.
good that he's running his race. Best of luck to him. The Coors family, by contrast, saw some like fellow feeling towards Augie Bush, specifically with regards to Anheuser-Busch's labor challenges when the Teamsters strike AB. What is this, like late 60s, early 70s? Joe Coors at this point is an ultra conservative sort of
Mm-hmm.
godfather of the neoconservative movement with Reagan, whatever. He is getting himself worked into a tizzy about labor unions contributing to the undoing of the American dream, or whatever, however you want to phrase it. So when the Teamsters strike AB in a pretty acrimonious strike that lasts whatever 100 days or so,
Long, yeah.
Coors doesn't go after AB's tap handles, doesn't go after their shelf space, deliberately stays on the sidelines with this great opportunity. But then when Coors has trouble 5 years later with labor, AB doesn't give a shit.
Of course they don't.
Yeah, they're like, this is war, motherfucker. Like, that's your own fault.
This is Survivor. It is Survivor. Again, it's important to realize the attrition rate. And famously in 1978, there are a couple of numbers, but there were only 49 actual brewing companies in the US, and that included a handful of micros. There just aren't that many brewers. So if you are Anheuser-Busch in particular, you are keenly aware that if you really want to dominate the universe, man, it's in your grasp.
Yeah,
baby.
you are in the zone at that point.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh
Right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Maureen, once again, we've gone the distance here on Taplines. Once again, we have a barn burner of an episode that our listeners hopefully enjoyed as much as I did. Thank you so much for joining us again on the show. We leave our story, The Light Beer Wars, in 2008, when we finally see the inflection point on the light beer segment, and we start to see the slide that has only accelerated to the present day, 2023. I mean, we're seeing certainly decade over decade decline in beer, and massive declines in light beer in particular, in no small part. Part of the reason why is because of that piece of the puzzle that we've deliberately put on the sidelines for most of this conversation. But in 2008, the American drinking public really gets that mainstream taste for full flavored craft beer, and some of what's taking share away from the Bud Lights and the Miller Lights of the world at this point is those more full flavored beers by these upstart companies that are by then kind of established. Sierra Nevada, Boston Beer Company, Deschutes comes onto the scene in '94, and 10 years later is a strong a player in the space. So in some ways, the attrition and the slugfest that AB and Miller, and to some extent Coors, get into over the back half of the 20th century and into the first decade of the 21st, levels the field or exhausts the competitors and distracts them enough that all of a sudden we have a little bit of a new problem that we need to pay attention to. And it's these microbrewers who have a new name and have new momentum, these craft beers that our light beers look like water next to. And so that's we leave it there. Maureen, thank you so much again
welcome,
for
Dave.
joining us here on Taplines. And I guess, enjoy your life of never having drank a light beer. I hope that streak has continued.
Isn't that nuts? I just don't see the point. I mean, I suppose in the interest of professional interest, I should taste them, but I just don't get the point. Like
Well,
Michelob Ultra, I don't get the point.
They say war has many casualties, but your palate was not one of them for the light beer wars because you never experienced it.
Mm-mm.
Thank you again so much, Maureen.
Thank
you have
you,
a great
Dave.
great rest of your day, and we were so happy to have you on Taplines.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire VinePair team, and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mallon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sciarrino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes, you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.